The survey vessel Eternal Wisdom dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system 300 years ago, and its crew of Velthri scientists immediately began their routine scans of the third planet from the yellow star. Commander Sarah stood at the observation deck with his forearms crossed behind his back, watching the data scroll across the holographic displays with growing disappointment. Another dead world, he muttered to his second officer, a young female named Callus, who had hoped this mission would finally discover a new spacefaring species for the Galactic Concord. To welcome the readings told a grim story that the Velthri had seen many times before across their centuries of exploration. The planet called Earth by its former inhabitants showed all the signs of a civilization that had destroyed itself in nuclear fire. Massive radiation clouds still swirled through the atmosphere, blocking out the sunlight and creating a perpetual winter across most of the surface. The great cities that had once stood tall were now nothing but shadows burned into the ground, and the oceans had turned a sickly gray color from the ash and poison that filled them. Callus ran her sensitive fingers across the data panels and felt her heart sink as she processed the information. There are no life signs above basic bacteria and fungal organisms, she reported in a voice heavy with sadness. The dominant species appears to have wiped itself out approximately 50 years ago, based on the decay patterns of their structures. Commander Sarath nodded slowly and began the formal process of logging Earth in the Great Catalog, the massive database that contained information on every world the Galactic Concord had ever discovered, under the entry for the Sol system's third planet. He typed a classification that would define Earth for the next 3 centuries. Species 7891. Status extinct. Cause self-inflicted. Nuclear annihilation. Technological level at time of extinction. Early atomic age. Notes: another promising species that failed to overcome its aggressive nature before achieving spaceflight, the Eternal Wisdom, stayed in orbit for 3 more days to complete its survey. And during that time, the crew felt a deep melancholy settle over them like a heavy blanket. They had seen this before, many times, but it never got easier. Some species simply could not escape the trap of their own violence. They built weapons powerful enough to destroy their worlds before they built ships fast enough to escape them. The Velthri had almost suffered the same fate thousands of years ago, and they considered it their sacred duty to find young species and guide them toward peace before they could destroy themselves. But for Earth, they had arrived too late when the survey vessel finally turned away from the dead planet and engaged its faster-than-light drive. No one on board looked back. There was nothing left to see in the centuries that followed. Earth became a story told throughout the Galactic Concord, a cautionary tale shared with young species who were just beginning to develop dangerous technologies. See what happens when aggression outpaces wisdom, the teachers would say, showing images of Earth's ruined cities and poisoned oceans to their students. The humans had so much potential, but they could not overcome their primitive instincts. The story became so famous that it was included in the standard education of every Concord species. Children learned about Earth the same way they learned about mathematics and science. And the dead planet became a symbol of what happened when a species failed to grow beyond its violent nature. No one ever returned to the Sol system. There was no reason to visit a grave. The Galactic Concord continued to expand and thrive, welcoming new species into its peaceful union and building a civilization that spanned thousands of worlds for 300 years. The galaxy enjoyed an era of prosperity and cooperation. That seemed like it would last forever. Then the Hollow came. No one knew where they originated or what they truly wanted. They appeared at the edge of Concord space like a tide of darkness. Billions of biomechanical creatures that existed only to consume and multiply. The first world they encountered was a small colony called verdant hope. Home to 12 million members of the peaceful Lorthy species, the hollow swarm descended on the planet, like locusts on a field of grain. And within 3 days, there was nothing left but bare rock and silence. The Concord responded with force, sending their combined fleet to stop the invasion before it could spread further. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, 70% of the Concord fleet was destroyed, and the Hollow continued their advance without pause. World after world fell to the swarm over the following months. The Tereshi homeworld, with its crystal spires that had stood for 10,000 years. The Velthari agricultural colonies that fed 100 billion people. The great space stations that served as centers of learning and culture for dozens of species, all of them consumed, all of them silenced. The leaders of the Galactic Concord gathered in emergency session on their capital world of Thiessen Prime to discuss options that grew fewer with each passing day. "We cannot stop them," admitted Grand Admiral Varth, his ancient face lined with exhaustion and despair. "Our weapons barely scratch their hulls, and for every creature we kill, 10 more take its place." Prime Chancellor Myra looked around the chamber at the representatives of 100 species, all of them showing the same fear and hopelessness in their alien features. "Then we must call for help," she declared. "We will broadcast on every frequency, in every direction, and pray that someone out there hears us." The message was composed with desperate care and sent, screaming into the void at the speed of light, carrying the last hope of a dying civilization. "This is the Galactic Concord calling any who can hear us." The transmission began. "We face extinction at the hands of an enemy we cannot defeat alone, and we beg any species capable of rendering aid to answer our call." The message repeated endlessly, echoing through the empty spaces between stars and reaching into the darkest corners of the galaxy where no Concord vessel had ever traveled. For weeks there was only silence in response, then something answered from the direction of a dead world that had been forgotten for 300 years, something that should not have existed, something that called itself humanity. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the command bridge of the U.S. Resurrection with her hands clasped behind her back and her dark eyes fixed on the holographic display that floated before her. The distress call from the Galactic Concord played on repeat, its desperate words filling the bridge with the sound of aliens begging for salvation from an enemy they could not defeat. Around her, the bridge crew worked in focused silence, their movements precise and practiced. After years of training in the underground academies of new Terra Lieutenant Commander Marcus Chun turned from his communication station with a questioning look on his weathered face. "Admiral, we have confirmed the authenticity of the transmission," he reported. "It originated from a region of space, approximately 40 light-years from our current position, and appears to be a genuine plea for military assistance." Tanaka nodded slowly and let the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders like a familiar burden. For 300 years, humanity had believed itself alone in the universe, the only survivors of a catastrophe that had nearly ended their existence. Now they knew the truth. There were others out there, and those others were dying. "Open a channel to Fleet Command," she ordered, her voice steady and calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. The holographic image of Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo appeared before her within seconds, his silver hair and scarred face marking him as one of the oldest living veterans of the Reconstruction Wars. "Admiral Tanaka," he greeted her with a slight nod. "I assume you have heard the alien transmission." "I have, sir," Tanaka replied, "and I am requesting permission to lead an expeditionary fleet to render assistance." The silence that followed her request stretched for several long seconds as Okonkwo considered the implications of what she was asking. Humanity had spent 3 centuries rebuilding from the ashes of nuclear war, clawing their way back from the brink of extinction through sheer determination and stubborn refusal to die. They had emerged from their bunkers into a world that wanted to kill them. A planet so poisoned that simply breathing the air could be lethal without protective equipment. They had fought against mutated creatures that crawled from the irradiated wastes, against the collapse of all social order, against starvation and disease and the constant temptation of despair, and they had won. They had rebuilt their civilization in underground cities carved from bedrock and slowly expanded back to the surface as they developed technologies to clean the soil and purify the water. They had launched their first spacecraft 50 years ago and discovered that the stars were within their reach if they were willing to work hard enough to grasp them. Now they had a fleet of 300 warships, vessels designed and built by people who had learned to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. You want to reveal our existence to an alien civilization we know nothing about, Okonkwo said flatly. You want to risk our ships and our people in a conflict that is not our concern. With respect, sir, Tanaka replied, I want to help people who are facing the same extinction we nearly suffered. And I believe it is exactly our concern. She stepped forward and let her passion show in her voice for the first time. We know what it feels like to face annihilation. And we know what it feels like to call out for help and hear nothing but silence in response. Okonkwo's expression remained unreadable as he listened to her words. The decision is not mine alone to make, he finally said. I will convene the Council of Admirals and the civilian leadership, and we will decide together whether humanity is ready to announce itself to the galaxy. The meeting that followed lasted for 6 hours and became one of the most important debates in human history. Some argued that humanity should remain hidden and protect itself from unknown dangers. Others pointed out that the aliens might turn hostile once they learned that humans had survived. But in the end, the argument that won was the simplest one of all. They are asking for help, said Council Speaker Elena Rodriguez, a voice carrying the weight of humanity's collective conscience. And we have the power to answer. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Humanity would respond to the call. Admiral Tanaka returned to the Resurrection with orders to assemble an expeditionary fleet of 150 warships and proceed to Concord space at maximum speed within 72 hours. The fleet was ready. The ships gathered in formation around the Resurrection, their hulls gleaming with the distinctive angular design that human engineers had developed for maximum combat effectiveness. These were not beautiful ships by any standard. They were covered in thick armor plating and bristling with weapons, their surfaces scarred and pitted from years of combat, testing against the harshest conditions Earth could provide. They were ugly, brutal, and absolutely terrifying to behold. Admiral Tanaka stood on her bridge and surveyed the fleet that would carry humanity back into the light of the galactic stage. Open a channel, she commanded. All frequencies, maximum power. When the channel was open, she spoke the words that would change the course of galactic history. This is Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the United Earth Fleet. Responding to the distress call from the Galactic Concorde, she paused for a moment and felt the eyes of her entire crew upon her. We have received your transmission and we are coming to assist. So hold your positions and do not lose hope. Another pause as she gathered herself for the final declaration. Help is on the way. The message screamed across the void at the speed of light, reaching Concord space hours before the fleet would arrive. When it did, the effect was immediate and profound. Prime Chancellor Myra was in the middle of an emergency session when her communications officer burst into the chamber with a look of total shock on his face. Chancellor, he stammered. We have received a response to our distress call. The entire chamber fell silent as the officer played the transmission for all to hear when it finished. Myra turned to her science advisor with confusion written across her features. "What species sent this message?" she demanded. "Our records show no spacefaring civilization in that region of space." The science advisor checked his data tablet 3 times before answering, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Chancellor, the transmission originated from the Sol system, and the language matches the archived recordings we have of the extinct species known as humans." "That is impossible," Myra whispered. "The humans destroyed themselves 300 years ago." "Apparently," the science advisor replied with wide eyes. "They did not. The dead were coming to save the living, and they were bringing warships." The last 47 ships of the Galactic Concord Defense Fleet held their position above Thiessen Prime with the grim determination of soldiers who knew they were about to die. Grand Admiral Vorath stood on the bridge of his flagship Eternal Light and watched the hollow swarm approaching like a living cloud of death. There were millions of them, each creature a nightmare of twisted metal and organic tissue that defied all understanding of natural evolution. They moved as one. A single hungry intelligence spread across countless bodies, and they had never been stopped by anything the Concorde could throw at them. "All ships report ready," his tactical officer announced in a voice that barely concealed her terror. "Very well," Vorath replied with the calm acceptance of someone who had made peace with his fate. "We will buy as much time as we can for the evacuation transports, and when we fall, let it be said that we fell fighting." His crew responded with silent nods and returned to their stations with renewed focus. They all knew this was the end, but they would face it with dignity on the surface below. Billions of Concord citizens crowded into evacuation centers that could only hold a fraction of their numbers. The transports that had been launched in the previous days had already carried away as many as possible. But there were simply too many people and not enough ships. Those who remained had accepted that they would share the fate of their world. Prime Chancellor Myra had refused to leave, choosing to stay with her people until the very end. She stood in the observation tower of the Grand Council building and watched the distant lights of the fleet preparing to make its final stand. "Chancellor," her aide interrupted softly, "the human fleet should be arriving within the hour if their transmission was accurate." Myra shook her head slowly and felt the weight of despair pressing down on her hearts. "Even if they come, what can they possibly do against the Hollow?" she asked without expecting an answer. Their world was destroyed 3 centuries ago, and whatever survivors remained cannot have the resources to challenge an enemy that has crushed 17 of our worlds. She turned away from the window and prepared to address her people one final time in orbit. The hollow swarm had closed the weapons range and began their attack with the mindless hunger that had consumed so many worlds before. Beams of energy and clouds of projectiles slammed into the Concorde ships, tearing through shields and armor with terrible efficiency. The Eternal Light shuddered under the impact of a dozen strikes, and warning alarms filled the bridge with their urgent screaming. "Shields at 40%. The tactical officer reported. 3 ships destroyed, 7 more heavily damaged. Vorath gripped his command chair and ordered a counterattack that he knew would accomplish nothing. The Concorde weapons flashed against the hollow swarm, destroying hundreds of creatures. But thousands more took their place immediately. It was like trying to empty an ocean with a cup. Then space itself tore open. The dimensional rift appeared directly between the Concorde fleet and the hollow swarm. A wound in reality that blazed with blue-white light so intense that every sensor in the system temporarily overloaded when the light faded. The human fleet was there. 150 warships emerged from the rift in perfect combat formation, their angular hulls painted in dark colors that seemed to drink in the light of the nearby stars. They were covered in scars and armor plating, their surfaces bristling with weapons that the Concorde scanners could barely identify. At the center of the formation flew the largest vessel, a massive dreadnought that dwarfed even the hollow command creatures. The UES Resurrection had arrived. Admiral Tanaka surveyed the tactical display on her bridge and immediately understood the desperate situation. The Concorde fleet was outmatched beyond any hope of victory, and the swarm was large enough to consume a dozen worlds without slowing down. All ships, combat spread, she ordered calmly. Target the swarm density clusters and fire at will. She opened a channel to the Concorde flagship and spoke words that Vorath would remember for the rest of his very long life. Concorde vessels. This is Admiral Tanaka of the United Earth Fleet, and I suggest you form up behind our line while we handle the immediate threat. Vorath stared at the communication, displaying shock as he tried to process what he was seeing. These humans, these ghosts from a dead world, had just placed themselves between his fleet and certain destruction. Admiral, he responded with a voice made rough by emotion. We are grateful for your assistance, but the Hollow cannot be defeated, and you will only sacrifice your ships for nothing. Tanaka's reply carried a tone that Vorath had never heard before, a mixture of confidence and something darker that he could not identify. Grand Admiral, my people have been fighting for survival since before your ancestors knew what space travel was, and we did not come here to lose. The Resurrection opened fire. The main batteries of the human dreadnought unleashed a barrage of weapons that the Concorde had never seen before. Projectiles accelerated to significant fractions of light. Speed tore through the hollow swarm like hot knives through soft butter. Energy weapons that burned with the fury of captive stars vaporized dozens of creatures with each shot. But it was the missiles that truly shocked the watching aliens. The warheads detonated with the unmistakable signature of nuclear weapons, filling space with radiation and fire that the Hollow could not adapt to quickly enough. The swarm recoiled from the assault as thousands of creatures were destroyed in seconds. Behind the Resurrection, the rest of the human fleet added their own firepower to the attack. Darkness of space became a continuous storm of weapons fire as humanity demonstrated what 3 centuries of survival had taught them about war on the bridge of the eternal light. Vorath watched with his mouth hanging open in complete disbelief. Impossible, his tactical officer whispered. They are actually pushing the swarm back. Vorath found his voice and issued orders that he had never expected to give all Concorde ships. Follow the human lead and concentrate fire on any targets they identify. He paused and looked at the display showing the human fleet fighting with a ferocity that bordered on madness. And someone please tell me how a dead species learned to fight like that. No one had an answer, but as the battle raged on and the hollow swarm began to falter for the first time in its terrible existence, the surviving members of the Galactic Concorde began to understand something important. The humans had not died 300 years ago. They had simply been learning how to survive, and now they had come to share that lesson with the galaxy. The Hollow Swarm had consumed 17 worlds and destroyed the combined fleets of 100 species without ever experiencing anything that could be called a setback. They were the perfect predators, a collective intelligence that learned from every encounter and adapted to overcome any defense. Every weapon that had been used against them had been analyzed and countered. Within hours, every tactic had been predicted and nullified. Every species that had stood against them had fallen, until now the human fleet carved through the swarm like a blade through flesh, and the Hollow found themselves facing something that their vast collective memory had never encountered before: an enemy that did not behave the way prey was supposed to behave. Admiral Tanaka watched the tactical display on her bridge as her fleet engaged the swarm across a front that stretched for thousands of kilometers, the Hollow were attempting their standard encirclement maneuver, splitting into multiple groups to surround and overwhelm individual ships. It was a tactic that had worked countless times against Concord vessels. Against the humans, it failed completely. Squadron 7. Break left and target the flanking group. Tanaka ordered calmly. Squadron 12. I want you to punch through the center and hit their command creatures. The human ships responded with the precision of a single organism. Their movements coordinated through neural link technology that allowed captains to share tactical information. Instantaneously, the Hollow had never faced an enemy that could react as fast as they could. When the swarm attempted to board human vessels, they discovered another terrible surprise. The airlocks of the Resurrection blew open as the first wave of Hollow creatures attached themselves to the hull. And instead of the panicked defenders that the swarm expected, they found Marine Sergeant Major Elena. Vasquez led her squad into the corridor with a plasma rifle in her hands and absolutely no fear in her heart. She had grown up in the radiation zones of what used to be Eastern Europe, fighting mutated predators that made the Hollow look almost pleasant by comparison. Contact front, she announced through her helmet communicator. Weapons free. The Marines opened fire with the weapons that had been specifically designed for fighting in the toxic wastelands of post-apocalyptic Earth. Their rifles fired projectiles tipped with radioactive isotopes that tore through hollow armor and poisoned any creature that survived the initial impact. The swarm creatures that made it past the guns were met with close combat weapons that the humans called Hellblades, vibrating monomolecular edges powered by miniature fusion cells. Vasquez cut down 3 hollow creatures in as many seconds and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a job well done. These things are softer than the rad stalkers back home, she commented to her squad as they advanced through the corridor toward the next breach point on the Bridge of the Eternal Light. Grand Admiral Vorath watched the human Marines defending their ships and felt something he had not experienced in months of fighting the Hollow Hope. How is this possible? His tactical officer asked in a voice filled with wonder. The Hollow have never been stopped like this before. Mara studied the data streaming across his displays and began to understand what made the humans different. Look at their ship designs, he said slowly. Their armor is layered with materials that resist energy weapons and shrapnel. Exactly the kind of threats you would face in a nuclear war. He highlighted a section of the tactical display showing human Marines fighting in close quarters, and their soldiers were full environmental suits with independent life support, just like you would need to survive in a radioactive wasteland. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They did not build these ships to fight the Hollow, he said quietly. They built them to survive on a dying world where everything was trying to kill them. The Hollow swarm was fighting an enemy that had been forged in the fires of nuclear apocalypse, hardened by 3 centuries of struggling against extinction itself. They were fighting humanity at its most dangerous, and they were losing. The battle raged for 6 hours as the human fleet systematically dismantled the swarm ship after ship fell on both sides. But the exchange rate was devastating for the Hollow. For every human vessel destroyed, they lost thousands of creatures and dozens of their precious command organisms. Admiral Tanaka felt each loss like a knife in her heart. But she did not allow herself to grieve. There would be time for that later. The swarm is attempting to disengage, her tactical officer reported with surprise in his voice. They are retreating toward the outer system. Tanaka allowed herself a small smile that held no warmth. Pursue and destroy, she ordered. I want nothing left that can threaten this world. The human fleet surged forward with renewed aggression, chasing the fleeing swarm with the relentless determination that had allowed their species to survive. When all logic said they should have died, The final engagement lasted only 2 more hours. When it was over, the hollow swarm that had threatened Thesum Prime was completely destroyed. Millions of creatures had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris that would eventually fall into the local star. The human fleet had paid a terrible price for their victory. 60 ships had been lost, taking thousands of crew members with them. Not a single vessel had surrendered. Not a single crew had retreated. They had fought until they won or died, just as their ancestors had fought in the bunkers and caves of a poisoned Earth 300 years ago. Admiral Tanaka stood on her bridge and looked at the debris field that marked the grave of so many of her people. "Communications," she said quietly. "Send a message to the Concorde flagship." When Grand Admiral Varath appeared on her display, she spoke the words that would be remembered for generations. "The immediate threat has been neutralized," she reported. "Thesum Prime is secure." Varath stared at her with an expression that mixed gratitude with something that might have been awe. "Admiral Tanaka," he said slowly, "on behalf of the Galactic Concorde, I thank you for saving our world and our people." He paused and seemed to struggle with his next words. "But I must ask you a question that has been burning in my mind since you first appeared." Tanaka nodded for him to continue. "How did you survive?" Varath asked. "Your world was destroyed, and yet you are here, and you fight like nothing we have ever seen." The Admiral looked at him with eyes that had seen things no living Concorde citizen could imagine. "That is a long story," she replied, "and I think it would be better told in person." She straightened her uniform and prepared for the meeting that would change the relationship between humanity and the galaxy forever. "Chancellor Myra has requested an audience with me, and I believe she has the same questions you do." The battle was over, but the real work was just beginning. The Grand Council Chamber of Thesum Prime had been designed to inspire awe in anyone who entered its vast space. Towering pillars of crystal rose toward a domed ceiling that displayed real-time images of the stars beyond, and the floor was made of polished stone that had been quarried from the oldest mountains on the planet for 3,000 years. This chamber had hosted the most important meetings in Concorde history, but nothing that had happened here before could compare to this moment. Prime Chancellor Mira sat at the head of the curved council table, surrounded by representatives from every surviving member species of the Galactic Concorde. They had gathered to meet the ghosts who had saved them from extinction. Admiral Yuki Tanaka entered the chamber alone, her dress uniform crisp and her bearing military perfect. She walked with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove, and every alien eye in the room followed her progress to the speaker's platform at the center of the space. "Admiral Tanaka," Chancellor Myra began in a voice that carried throughout the chamber. "On behalf of the Galactic Concorde and the billions of lives you have saved, I offer our deepest gratitude." She paused and let the weight of her next words settle over the assembled representatives. "But we have questions that must be answered before we can move forward." Tanaka nodded with understanding and waited for the Chancellor to continue. 300 years ago, a Concorde survey vessel visited your world and found it destroyed by nuclear war. With no signs of surviving sapient life, Mira leaned forward with intensity burning in her eyes. "How is it possible that you are standing here today? And where did you find the resources to build a fleet capable of defeating an enemy that crushed our combined military forces?" The silence that followed her question was so complete that Tanaka could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She took a deep breath and began to tell the story that every human knew by heart. 300 years ago, your survey vessel was correct in its assessment, she said slowly. Our world had been devastated by a nuclear war, and the surface was uninhabitable for any unprotected life form. She pulled a small device from her pocket and activated a holographic display that showed images of Earth as it had looked in those dark days' ruined cities. poisoned oceans, skies choked with ash and radiation. But your vessel only scanned the surface, Tanaka continued. They did not detect the bunkers that had been built deep underground, where a few million humans huddled together and refused to accept that they were supposed to die. The images changed to show vast underground complexes carved from solid rock. Their walls lined with hydroponic gardens and water recycling, systems that kept the survivors alive in the depths of hell. For the first 50 years, we simply tried not to go extinct, Tanaka explained. We grew food under artificial lights, purified water through filters made from salvaged technology, and buried our dead in mass graves because there was no room for individual burial. Her voice remained steady, but every alien in the chamber could hear the weight of history in her words. Millions died from radiation sickness, starvation, and disease. But millions more survived through sheer stubbornness and the refusal to accept defeat. The holographic display showed humans in protective suits venturing onto the surface, fighting against mutated creatures that had evolved in the radiation, slowly reclaiming small patches of land that could be cleaned and cultivated. After 100 years, we had stabilized our population and begun to rebuild our technology base, and after 200 years, we had developed the means to cleanse our world and expand back to the surface. Tanaka looked directly at Chancellor Myra with an expression that was impossible to read. Your people declared us extinct and moved on with your lives, but we were still down there in the dark, learning how to survive in conditions that should have killed us all. She switched the display to show images of human shipyards hidden beneath mountain ranges, producing the first generation of spacecraft that would carry humanity back to the stars. When we finally reached space 50 years ago, we discovered that the galaxy was already inhabited by species who thought we were dead. A murmur ran through the council chamber as the representatives processed this information. We chose to remain hidden while we built our fleet and studied the galactic situation from a distance. Tanaka continued. We were not sure how other species would react to our survival, and we wanted to be prepared for any possibility. Chancellor Myra raised her hand to quiet the whispers spreading through her colleagues. That explains how you survived and how you built your ships, she said thoughtfully. But it does not explain why you came to help us when you could have remained hidden and safe. Tanaka was quiet for a long moment before she answered. Because we remember what it was like to be alone and dying with no one coming to help. Her words carried a pain that transcended language and species, a universal truth that every being in the chamber could understand. When our world was burning and our people were dying by the billions, we sent out distress calls on every frequency we could manage, begging anyone who could hear us to send aid. She looked around the chamber at the alien faces watching her with growing understanding. No one answered. The simple statement hung in the air like an accusation against the entire galaxy. We do not blame you for that. Tanaka added quickly, your survey vessel came too late, and you had no way of knowing that survivors remained. She stepped forward and spoke with an intensity that made several council members lean back in their seats. But we know what it feels like to face extinction alone. And when we heard your call for help, we could not pretend we had not heard it. Chancellor Myra stood from her seat and walked around the council table to stand before the human. Admiral, you came to save strangers who had written you off as dead, at the cost of 60 ships and thousands of your own people. She looked into Tanaka's eyes and saw something there that she would spend years trying to understand. Why would you sacrifice so much for species you had never met? Tanaka smiled for the first time since entering the chamber, and there was something fierce and unbreakable in that expression. Because that is what survivors do, she replied. We help each other, even when it costs us dearly. Because we know that survival alone means nothing if we lose our humanity in the process. She used an old Earth word that the translation system struggled to convey. but every being in the chamber somehow understood its meaning. We survived the death of our world through something that does not translate well into your languages. Tanaka searched for the right way to explain, and finally settled on the simplest possible description. Spite, we call it, which is the refusal to die simply because the universe expects you to. She gestured at the chamber around her, and the world beyond its walls. The universe declared us dead 300 years ago. And we took that personally, so we survived out of spite and rebuilt out of spite, and reached the stars out of spite. Chancellor Myra felt something shift in her understanding of the galaxy and its newest inhabitants. And now you have brought that spite to our aid against an enemy that we could not defeat. We have, Tanaka confirmed, and we are not finished yet, because somewhere out there the hollows still exist, and they will not stop until they are completely destroyed. She looked around the chamber one final time and let her words carry the weight of a promise. Humanity remembers what it means to face extinction, and we will not rest until no other species has to face that fate alone ever again. The council chamber erupted in discussion as the representatives tried to process what they had just heard. 1 week later, the Galactic Concord officially updated its great catalog to reflect the new reality. Species 7891. Status: ACTIV, A classification. Allied. Special note: do not underestimate, do not provoke, and do not under any circumstances declare them extinct. They take it personally.